The storm had been moving east for 3 days before it stopped moving at all. That was the first sign. The meteorologists noted it, flagged it, sent the report up the chain with language carefully chosen to avoid panic. Stationary weather systems were not impossible. They were merely improbable. And when the system did not resume its eastward drift by the 4th day, when the barometric readings came back in a configuration that had no precedent in recorded human history, the language in the reports changed. The careful words fell away. What replaced them was simpler: "We don't know what this is." Sergeant Elia's Cord had been staring at the same stretch of Hungarian plains for 6 hours when the sky split open. It did not split with fire or lightning or the cinematic drama of an earth-ending event. It split the way ice cracks in spring, slowly at first, a sound more felt than heard, a deepening in the air that his body recognized before his mind did. He set down the steel thermos he'd been nursing since dawn and watched the horizon go wrong. The light over the pusta flattened. Shadows bent sideways. And then something vast and dark descended through the torn seam of the atmosphere, not falling but lowering itself, the way a person lowers into cold water, with deliberation. He'd read the briefings. Every soldier in the NATO Rapid Response Unit had been handed the same 12 pages of classified summary 3 weeks ago, when the first arrivals had come down over Siberia and the Kazakh steppe and the outer stretches of the Gobi. The document was clinical and bloodless and told them very little of use. Entities of unknown origin, mass exceeding initial estimation, behavior non-aggressive, do not engage, stand by. Stand by. Elias picked up his thermos, took a long drink of cold coffee, and watched the thing settle onto the earth 4 kilometers away. The ground shook. Not dramatically, not the way disaster movies had promised, but with a low, rolling persistence, like a ship passing close underwater. Birds flushed from the grassland in a dark wave. Somewhere behind him, a private named Wojcik was sick in the drainage ditch, quietly, with the apologetic efficiency of a man who had decided that vomiting was acceptable, but making noise about it was not. The thing was alive. Elias was certain of that before anything else. It breathed. He could see the motion of it even at distance, great slow inflations along its flanks, the rhythm of something vast and patient. Its hide was dark, almost black, but where the late afternoon light caught it, the surface shimmered with an iridescent depth that suggested structure beneath structure, not armor, but something more complex, something grown rather than built. Limbs of indeterminate number moved with a slowness that was not sluggishness but precision. The creature was not confused or distressed. It was examining the landscape with the same quiet attention that Elias was examining it. He did not feel fear. Not exactly. What he felt was the specific vertigo of scale revision, the cognitive lurch of suddenly understanding that the frame of reference he had been using all his life was the wrong size for the world he was standing in. His radio crackled. Lieutenant Colonel Seged, from the command post 8 kilometers back. "Cord, what's your visual?" One entity, grounded, stationary, breathing. A pause, threat assessment. Elias watched the creature turn its head, if head was the right word for it, which he doubted, in a slow arc that suggested it was orienting to something it could hear or smell. It did not orient toward the soldiers. It oriented toward the distant line of trees at the plain's edge, and then it was still. "Negative threat," he said, "not even curious about us." Another pause, longer this time. "Stand by." Stand by. There it was again. He stood by. The light changed. The creature did not move. Around him, the soldiers of his unit held their positions with the discipline of trained men doing something that training had not prepared them for, which was standing close to something ancient and enormous, and being offered no instruction about what to feel. Corporal Adisa Mensa low-crawled to Elias' position without being asked, because Adisa always knew when Elias was thinking hard, and had decided early in their partnership that thinking hard was a 2-person job. "It's looking at the trees," Adisa said. I noticed. There's a village 3 kilometers past the tree line. I know. Adisa was quiet for a moment. Then, it's not moving toward it. No. The ones in Siberia didn't move toward anything either. They came down and they stopped. Elias nodded slowly. He had read that in the briefing, in the section where the language was most careful. Entities appear to be in a state of orientation. Possible that arrival process is disorienting. Possible that entities require recovery time post-transit. Or, the briefing had not said but Elias had thought. Possible that they aren't sure where they are, and they're standing very still trying to figure it out. That was not the thought of a soldier assessing a threat. That was the thought of someone who had once been 12 years old and gotten off a train in a city he didn't know, and stood on the platform with his single bag and his uncertain heart, trying to read the signs. He filed it away. The orders came at dusk: hold position, no contact, report any change in behavior. The creature remained stationary throughout the night. Elias slept in 2-hour increments, and each time he woke he checked the horizon and the creature was there, visible against the stars, its slow breathing marking time in the dark. The summit convened in Vienna on the 8th day. It was not called a summit. It was called an extraordinary session of the UN Security Council plus invited representatives, which was the kind of language that bureaucracies used when they were doing something they had never done before and needed to make it sound procedural. Elias was not invited to Vienna. He was invited to stand outside a building in Vienna, where the people who were invited could look at him through a window and feel reassured that a man with a gun was nearby. He stood outside the building and listened to the briefings through a receiver someone had forgotten to turn off. He heard the French delegate describe the entities as a category 1 existential threat. He heard the Brazilian delegate respond that no entity had demonstrated lethal behavior in 11 days of contact, and that perhaps the category was premature. He heard the Chinese delegate note that 3 entities had settled within 5 kilometers of the Three Gorges Dam and had not moved. He heard the Russian delegate say nothing for 20 minutes and then say that Russia's position would be delivered in writing. He heard the delegate from the Galactic Convergence speak for the first time. He had not known she was in the room. The briefing documents had not mentioned a galactic convergence and the existence of such an organization. A diplomatic body representing what he would come to understand was a loose alliance of 17 spacefaring civilizations, had apparently been known to approximately 40 humans on Earth for the past 19 months, which struck him as roughly 40 people too few. Her translator spoke for her, a flat, synthesized voice that rendered her words into English with perfect grammar and zero cadence. "We regret the disruption to your world," the translator said. "The entities you call creatures are known to us as the Caliph. They are not invaders. They are displaced. Their transit was uncontrolled, a consequence of the event that destroyed their home system. They arrived here because the resonance of your world's magnetic field was compatible with their physiology. They are survivors. They are frightened. They do not understand your world and you do not understand them, and in this shared confusion lies the only danger either of you faces." A long silence in the room. "The convergence has sent me to facilitate contact," the translator continued. "Formal contact between the Caliph and a designated representative of humanity. We are prepared to begin this process at your discretion." What followed was, by all accounts that Elias later read and heard, a masterpiece of institutional failure. The French delegate said that any formal contact required a legal framework that did not yet exist. The American delegate said that contact could not be authorized without presidential approval, and that presidential approval could not be granted without congressional notification, and that congressional notification could not occur without a classified briefing process that would take a minimum of 30 days. The Russian delegate delivered his written position, which said nothing, but implied a great deal. The German delegate proposed a working group. The British delegate seconded the working group. The Japanese delegate asked whether the Caliph had legal personhood under international law, which was an excellent question that nobody answered. The delegate from the Galactic Convergence waited. Her name, the translator had offered at the opening, was Sevarin. She was the Queen Speaker of the Convergence, the title indicating both her diplomatic authority and her biological role. The Convergence's founding species were matrilineal, and the title was structural, not ceremonial. She had traveled 4 light years in 11 days to facilitate this meeting. She had been waiting for 11 days before the meeting began, in a room in the Viennese building that no one had wanted to enter, with patience that the humans in the chamber could not measure because they had never encountered its kind before. Elias heard all of this through the receiver and felt a specific and quiet fury that he recognized as the emotion he felt whenever institutions did what institutions were designed to do, which was protect themselves from the necessity of decision. He also felt something else, something he did not have a word for yet. The sense that somewhere in that building, a being who had come an unimaginable distance to help was being made to wait in a room, alone. He found out later that the delegates had been invited to formally greet the Queen Speaker before the session. Protocol required it. Each delegation had been given the same briefing. Sevarin was the supreme diplomatic authority of the Convergence, her role analogous to a head of state. The customary greeting involved a specific gesture, not a bow, the briefing was careful to note, but a posture of mutual acknowledgement, a brief lowering of the head combined with an opening of the hands, an offering of visible honesty. To decline the greeting was not impolite. To perform it incorrectly was not catastrophic, but to perform it was to signal something important. I see your authority. I acknowledge the distance you have traveled. I am willing to begin. Of the 14 delegations present, 12 had declined the greeting on advice of their legal teams, who had determined that performing an alien diplomatic gesture might constitute an implicit recognition of the Convergence's authority over Earth, which might have legal ramifications that were as yet unclear. The German and British delegates had attempted the gesture, but done it wrong, heads tilting left when the gesture required a rightward inclination, which Sevarin's protocol officer had noted without expression, and which the briefing documents had marked as a significant inauspicious signal. Sevarin had received 12 refusals, 2 incorrect attempts, and then sat in her room through 6 hours of procedural debate that she followed through translation, in silence, her expression unreadable to the humans who glimpsed her through the security monitors. Elias did not see the security monitors. He was outside in the Viennese cold, listening through the receiver, watching his breath cloud and dissipate, and thinking about a 12-year-old boy on a train platform who had not known where the signs would lead. He made the decision the way he made most decisions that actually mattered, not with deliberation, but with the recognition that the decision had already been made somewhere underneath his thinking, and his conscious mind was the last to know. He walked to the entrance of the building and told the Austrian security officer that he needed to speak with the event coordinator about a perimeter adjustment. The Austrian security officer, who had been standing in the cold for the same 6 hours, and was therefore kindly disposed toward any excuse to go inside, took him to the event coordinator, who was a tired Swiss-German woman named Frau Kessler, who was managing 47 simultaneous crises and had no attention to spare for him. He asked Frau Kessler where the Convergence delegate was being hosted. She told him, because she had run out of the energy required to determine whether she should, and pointed him at an elevator. The room was at the end of a corridor on the 4th floor. 2 Convergence security officers stood outside it, beings he had never seen before, tall and still, with skin that seemed to shift color slightly in the overhead lights. They watched him approach with the flat attention of professionals evaluating a potential problem. He stopped 3 meters away, where stopping felt right, and he looked at them directly, and he said, "I'd like to request an audience with the Queen Speaker if she's willing." He did not have authorization for this. He did not have a diplomatic title or a legal framework or congressional approval. He had a sergeant's rank and a still warm thermos, and the specific stubbornness that comes from having stood very still in very cold fields for 6 days waiting for someone else to do something. The security officers exchanged a look that he couldn't read, and then the left one touched something at its collar and spoke in a low tone, and there was a pause, and then the door opened. The room was warmer than the corridor. It smelled faintly of something mineral, clean stone, or deep water, or perhaps something for which he had no reference, and it was lit lower than the corridor. The overhead lights dimmed to something gentler. Savarin stood near the window that overlooked the inner courtyard. She was smaller than he'd expected. The briefing documents had said nothing about her physical appearance, and the few images he'd seen had been taken from significant distance, and he realized now that he had filled the absence of information with assumptions drawn from every science fiction story he'd ever absorbed, none of which were useful. She stood approximately as tall as he did. Her features were arranged differently from a human face, but not so differently that the category of face was wrong. Her eyes were large and still, and the color of winter sea. She wore something that read as formal attire, layered and dark, with a quality to the fabric that suggested it was structural as well as decorative. Her hands were at her sides, and they were open. Ilya stopped inside the doorway. He thought about the briefing document. He thought about the gesture described in it, the lowering of the head and the opening of the hands. He thought about 12 delegations of human beings who had let their lawyers decide whether they were willing to begin. He lowered his head to the right. He opened his hands. He held the position for 3 seconds, which was what the briefing had specified, and then he raised his head and met her eyes. Savarin looked at him for a long moment. Then she performed the gesture in return, precise and unhurried, and when she raised her eyes to his, there was something in them that the translator would later tell him was the convergence word for something without a direct English equivalent. A feeling that combined relief and recognition, and a specific warmth for the unexpected. The way you feel when a stranger on a difficult road stops and offers you water. "Sergeant," the translator said, she had a small device at her throat. "You are the first human to greet me correctly." "I read the briefing," he said. "Your delegates also read the briefing." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Why did you come?" He thought about it for a moment, because the honest answer was complicated, and he wanted to give it honestly. "Someone came a long way," he said finally. "It seemed rude not to." The translator rendered this. Savarin was still for a moment. Then she made a sound, brief, low, resonant, that the translator did not render into English, and Elias understood from the quality of it, from something in the easing of her posture, that it was laughter. He was not invited to the formal session the following morning. He was not consulted when the Security Council finally authorized a working group to establish a framework for the possibility of formal contact, pending legal review. He was not mentioned in the communiqué released at the end of the session, which described the proceedings as constructive and ongoing. He was, however, sitting in the 4th-floor corridor when Savarin's door opened the next morning, and she walked out with her security officers for the second day of sessions, and she stopped when she saw him, and she performed the greeting gesture, and he returned it, and she said through the translator, "You are still here." "Didn't have anywhere else to be," he said, which was not entirely true. "I would like to speak with you," she said, "after the session." "I'll be here," he said. He was. The Caliph, Savarin explained to him that evening in the 4th-floor room, with the mineral smell and the dimmed lights and 2 cups of something hot that her security officer had provided, a convergence beverage that tasted like strong tea and something else, something faintly electric. The Caliph had no queen. That was a human projection, an attempt to impose familiar hierarchy on a species that organized itself differently. What the Caliph had was a prime resonator, the individual whose biological frequency set the baseline for the colony's cohesion. Remove the prime resonator and the colony fragmented. Keep the prime resonator stable and the colony followed. It was not leadership in any human sense. It was more like a heartbeat. The Caliph that arrived here, Elias said. The big ones. There are 47 colony groups, she said. Each one arrived with its prime resonator intact. This is why they are stationary. They are not resting. They are establishing resonance, mapping the local frequency of your world against their own. He thought about this, like tuning an instrument. A pause while the translator processed this. Savarin tilted her head in a way that he was beginning to recognize as the convergence equivalent of considering a new idea. Yes, she said, that is accurate. How long does it take? We don't know. The Caliph's last transit was 300 years ago. Their records of the process are incomplete. Elias held his cup and watched the steam rise from it. Outside the window, Vienna was lit up against the dark. The Baroque facades and the street lamps and the slow movement of late traffic, all of it looking both fragile and determined in the way that cities always looked to him when he came back to them from the field. The ones near the Three Gorges Dam, he said, near the villages, are they aware of the people there? Yes. Does that concern them or concern you? Savarin looked at him with the winter sea eyes. It concerned me greatly until 4 days ago, she said. When the prime resonator of the colony near your dam performed a behavior we had not observed before, it moved. He set down his cup. The briefing said. The briefing was written 4 days ago. I know because I was told of the movement by my observers at the same time your military was told. Your military communicated this to your Security Council. Your Security Council communicated this to the Legal Working Group. The working group is still deliberating. He stared at her. Where did it move? 3 kilometers south, she said. Away from the dam, away from the villages. It relocated its colony group to a position with no human settlement within 20 kilometers. The silence in the room was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when something has been said that is too large for immediate response, when understanding has to happen in stages. It knew, Elias said. It knew, Savarin agreed. He thought about a creature the size of a city block, 300 years removed from its last transit, in terrible disorientation on a world it had not chosen, becoming aware of the small, fragile things living near the water feature it had settled beside, and moving itself away from them with a care that no briefing document had suggested it possessed. What does that mean, he said, for the process, for contact? Savarin looked at him for a long time. Then she said something in her own language before the translator rendered it, and he heard in the original something that sounded like a word he almost knew, a shape of sound that felt important. It means, the translator said, that the Caliph are afraid of hurting you, and this, Sergeant, is the only thing that matters. A frightened being that fears its own capacity to harm is capable of conversation. The Convergence has 17 members. 12 of them were, at one point, as frightened as the Caliph are now. None of them were lost, not one. He drove back to his unit the following morning. He told no one what had happened in the 4th floor room, not because he was ordered not to, but because he had no language for it yet. The plane was still flat and gray. The creature was still at its position 4 kilometers out, still breathing its slow, immense breath, still turned slightly toward the tree line. He sat in the field and he looked at it and it did not look at him, but he had the sense, unmeasurable, unprovable, the kind of thing he would never put in a report, that it was aware of him in the same way that a very large and very tired person is aware of a small sound in the next room, not ignoring it, not attending to it, but holding it in the peripheral space where things are noticed without being addressed. He began to hum. Softly, barely sound at all, a tune his mother had sung while she cooked, something old and Hungarian and rhythmically complex, the kind of song that requires a certain stubbornness to carry because the time signature is impractical and the melody keeps wanting to resolve somewhere it can't. He hummed it because he was cold, and because the silence felt too large, and because it was the thing he always did when he was waiting in a difficult place. The creature's head moved, barely, a degree or two in his direction. He kept humming. Adisa appeared beside him at some point, because Adisa always appeared when Elias was doing something that required a witness, and sat in the grass and did not speak. And after a while Adisa began to hum along. He didn't know the tune, but he found it by ear, the way musicians do, falling into it from the side, and for a few minutes the two of them sat in the Hungarian plain and hummed an old song toward something the size of a mountain range, and the mountain range listened. The first formal contact session occurred 6 weeks later in a temporary structure erected on the plain. Elias was not part of the official delegation. He was assigned to security. He stood with his unit in a perimeter ring around the structure and listened through his earpiece as the designated contact team, a linguist, an astrophysicist, a diplomat from the Foreign Office, a xenobiologist, and a protocol officer from the Convergence, entered the structure and performed the greeting sequence. The Caliph colony's prime resonator, which the scientific team had been calling Subject 1 because they had not yet been offered its name, had moved to within 200 meters of the structure 2 days earlier and remained there, which the Convergence observer had indicated was a positive signal. Elias had not told anyone about the humming. He was a sergeant in a rapid response unit, not a xenobiologist, and the humming was the kind of thing that sounded, when described, either insignificant or insane. The contact session lasted 4 hours and produced, by all accounts, very little. The Caliph prime resonator did not respond to any of the Convergence's standard first contact protocols. It did not respond to the acoustic sequences. It did not respond to the light patterns. It breathed its slow, immense breath, and held its position, and the scientists stood in the structure and were patient and frustrated. On the 3rd day of contact sessions, during the lunch break, Elias walked to the perimeter edge nearest the Caliph's position. His lieutenant didn't notice, or noticed and decided not to care, which was a form of trust that only came from long partnership. He stood at the perimeter edge and he began to hum. The Caliph moved its head, immediately, unmistakably, in his direction. From inside the structure, the xenobiologist's voice came through his earpiece. "Something's happening. The resonance readings just changed. Something external." Elias kept humming. The Caliph lowered what served it as its head until it was closer to the ground, which the briefing documents would later describe as a submissive or investigative posture, but which felt to Elias like something much simpler. The way a very large animal brings itself closer to a very small sound so it can hear better. He hummed until his breath ran out, and then he stopped and the Caliph was still, and then it made a sound. He had not known that they made sounds. The briefing documents had not mentioned it. The sound was below the range of normal hearing. He felt it more than heard it, a pressure in his sternum, a warmth behind his eyes, but it had a shape, a structure, something that rose and fell in a pattern that was not random. A melody was too strong a word for it. But it was not noise. He hummed again, the same tune from the start. The Caliph's sound shifted a degree in response, not mirroring, something more subtle, something like harmony, the way a second voice finds the note that sits underneath the first and holds it so the first can breathe. The xenobiologist was saying something urgent in his earpiece. He turned it off. They communicated for 11 minutes. He had no way to know what was communicated, or whether communicated was even the right word. What he knew was that he had been in the field long enough to understand that conversation doesn't always begin with language. Sometimes it begins with the willingness to make a sound in the presence of something enormous and uncertain, and wait to see if the sound is returned. The Convergence Protocol officer came to find him after the session. She was a young Convergence officer with a measured expression and the quality of someone who had been trained to remain neutral and was finding it difficult. "How did you know to do that?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. She looked at him for a moment with something evaluative in her gaze. Then, "The prime resonator responded to you because your acoustic frequency falls within the Calith's communication range. Humans generally do not. The specific range you were using, the tune, passes through a window that the Convergence has never been able to identify in human vocal production. It may be specific to you, or to a particular musical tradition. We don't know yet." He thought about his mother in the kitchen, about the impractical time signature, about the way some songs refuse to resolve where they're supposed to because they know something about staying in motion that more sensible songs don't. "It's an old song," he said, "from the area. Maybe the Calith's frequency picked up something in the landscape when it arrived and the song matched it." He paused. "Or maybe I'm guessing." "You are guessing," she said, "but you're not wrong." Severin came to the plane on the 4th week. She did not attend the formal sessions. She arrived in the early morning before the contact team and stood at the perimeter with Elias, and they watched the Calith prime resonator emerge from its resting position in the slow light. "I wanted to see," she said. The translator was off. Her own voice, in her own language, was lower than the synthesized version, and warmer, and had within it the quality of someone who had spent a long time speaking in formal registers, and was briefly free of them. He did not speak the Convergence language, but he had been listening to it for 6 weeks, and he had the musician's habit of absorbing rhythm before meaning. So he heard in what she said not the words but the shape of them, and the shape said something like, "I wanted to see it with my own eyes, the thing I believed was possible, before the process takes it from the space where miracles live and moves it to the space where procedures live." He did not say this. He said, "It's different in the morning, more visible, it moves more." She made a small sound of agreement. They stood in the cold and watched. After a while she said something else, still in her own language, and then after a moment produced the translator and said it again. "My world was like this once, before the Convergence. There was a species that arrived in our system that was enormous and frightened and did not know our language. We attacked them. We lost 1,800 people before we stopped attacking. We lost 40 of their prime resonators. They are gone now. The last of that species died 200 years ago, and we carry them in our most formal ceremony, the acknowledgement of what we destroyed because we were afraid." The plane was very quiet. Far to the east the creature breathed. "The Convergence formed," she continued, "because 12 species looked at what happened and decided that the cost of that fear was too high to pay again. We built the diplomatic protocols. We learned the greeting gestures. We sent the Queen speakers." A pause. "And sometimes all of that is not enough. Sometimes what is enough is a sergeant who reads a briefing document and decides that someone came a long way and it would be rude not to show up." Elias thought about that for a while. Then he said, "What happens now with the Calith?" "Now," she said, "the Convergence will facilitate a resonance mapping, a process by which the Calith's prime resonators will calibrate to the frequency of this world so that they can move without disrupting it. It will take approximately 3 years. During that time, they will need to remain stationary and humanity will need to live alongside them. 3 years of 47 enormous stationary things." "Yes. And after?" She looked at him steadily. "After," she said, "they will have a home, not their original home. The Convergence cannot give them that, but a world where they can exist, and where the beings of that world know what they are, and the Calith know what humanity is, and neither is afraid of the other." He considered this. It sounded like a long process. It sounded like the kind of thing that required patience and stubbornness in equal measure. The kind of thing that would hit 100 procedural delays and legal working groups and delegates who needed 30 days and a classified briefing. The kind of thing that would require someone, at regular intervals, to remember that this had all started because a being came a long way and needed someone to show up. He thought he could probably manage that. "There is something else," Sevarin said. She had turned to face him directly, which in convergence protocol indicated that what followed was of significant personal weight, and he had learned enough of the protocol to stand still and receive it. "The Convergence Council has asked me to deliver an invitation. We would like a human liaison to the Convergence, not a diplomat, not a delegate, not a legal representative. A liaison, someone who is present, who communicates, who understands that the work is not done in the sessions but in the corridors outside them." She paused. "The council was specific that the invitation is for you." He looked at her. "I'm a sergeant." "Yes. I'm not a diplomat. I don't speak any of your languages. I'm not trained in convergence protocol. I just read a briefing once and made some guesses." "Yes," she said again. "The council found this particularly compelling." He looked out at the plane. The light had changed while they were talking, not morning anymore. Something moving toward midday. The sky opening from its gray into something more tentative, almost blue. The creature's breathing was steady and enormous and patient, the rhythm of something that had survived a very long journey by understanding that arrival is not the same thing as safety, and that safety comes only when the things around you choose to offer it. He thought about standing in this field for 6 days waiting for someone else to do something, and how that had felt, and how it still felt. He thought about a greeting gesture and a fourth-floor room and the mineral smell and the tea that tasted like electricity, and Sevarin's face when he'd correctly performed the gesture, the relief in it, the warmth in it, the word in her language that meant something between recognition and water on a difficult road. He thought about his mother's song, about the impractical time signature, about the way some melodies refuse to resolve where they're supposed to. "When do I start?" he said. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing that follows a first step is simple. The first step is the only moment when the possibility still feels clean. After that comes the work. The work was bureaucratic in ways that tested his patience daily. The work was linguistic in ways that required him to develop a new relationship with communication itself, to understand that meaning was not only carried in words, but in timing, in posture, in the deliberate absence of sound, in the specific weight of a pause. The work required him to sit in rooms full of people who were afraid and translate their fear into something the convergence could work with, and to sit in rooms full of convergence officials who were concerned and translate their concern into something that human governments could hear. He learned 40 words in the convergence diplomatic language by the end of the first month. He had 300 by the end of the third. He was not fluent. He suspected he never would be in any complete sense, but he was functional, which was a different thing and in some ways more useful. A fluent speaker knows the language. A functional speaker knows the weight of the words. He knew which words cost something to say. He knew which ones a speaker reached for when they were trying to be honest. He knew, gradually, which silences were thinking and which were grief. He learned the Caliph through the music. This was not a methodology the convergence had used before. The xenobiologists were skeptical and then were not. The frequency window that the protocol officer had identified was real, a narrow band within human vocal range that overlapped with the Caliph's lower communication register. And his particular voice sat in it naturally, though it had taken some searching to confirm that he was genuinely unusual in this way, and not simply being humored. He worked with a convergence acoustic specialist for 6 weeks, mapping the overlap, understanding how much information could be carried in it and how much was lost. What could be carried? Emotion, broadly. Intention, approximately. The difference between approach and withdrawal, between attention and dismissal, between patience and urgency. The Caliph communicated with enormous granularity within these categories. They had, the specialist estimated, something like 400 distinct emotional intentional states that their resonance could convey, where human music conveyed perhaps 30 or 40 with real precision. He was working in a constrained register, but constrained did not mean meaningless. What could not be carried or not yet, fact, language, the kind of exchange that allowed for plan making or negotiation. For that, the convergence was developing a new system, a technology for bridging the Calith's resonance communication to human symbolic language, and this was the work of years, not months. He was, then, a presence more than a translator. He was there to be present, to the Calith Prime resonators as they adjusted, as the resonance mapping proceeded, as the creatures gradually oriented to a world that was not their own, and to be present to the humans who lived near them, who woke every morning with something the size of several city blocks breathing at the edge of their vision, who did not feel what they were supposed to feel about that, who felt things that were more complicated and sometimes more generous, and sometimes less coherent than any briefing had anticipated. There was a woman in the village east of the plain named Urzsabet who was 84 years old, and had seen the Soviet tanks come through in 1956, and had therefore, she told Elias without particular drama, already exceeded her lifetime quota of enormous things happening near her house. She had made peace with the creature's presence in approximately 2 weeks, which she attributed to the fact that it did not make noise and had not broken anything yet, and you had to be practical about what you could control. She brought food to the security post at the plain's edge twice a week, without being asked, because soldiers were always hungry and someone should feed them. Elias brought her updates when he had them on the creature's state. She received them with the same pragmatic calm she brought to everything. She told him once, handing over a container of something warm and densely flavored, "You know what I think about those things," she gestured toward the plain. "I think they're homesick. They have the look of it, very big, very still. That's what homesick looks like when there's nothing to be done about it." He told Sevarin this the next time he saw her. Sevarin was silent for a moment, and then she said in her own language something that the translator rendered as, "She is correct, and she is also describing the convergence a little. Every one of our 17 members was homesick once for something that no longer existed. What we built instead was not home. It was the decision to remain." The 3-year mark came in early spring. He was standing on the plain. He was always standing on the plain for the significant moments, as if the landscape had decided to be his recurring backdrop, when the resonance mapping completed for the first colony group. The specialist told him through his earpiece that the readings had stabilized, that the prime resonator had achieved what the convergence called deep coherence, the state in which a Calith colony was fully integrated with the frequency field of its environment. The creature moved. Not toward anything, not away from anything. It simply walked slowly, with the deliberate precision of something enormous being careful, in a long arc across the plain, and when it had completed the arc it stopped at a new position, and the acoustics team said the resonance readings at the new position were different from the old one, richer, and that this was the Calith equivalent of settling. Elias stood in the field and watched it settle, and he thought, there it is. There is the moment that the procedural documents will refer to as the successful completion of phase 1 of the Calith integration initiative, which will sound manageable and organized, and nothing at all like what it actually was, which was something enormous and frightened finding a place where it could breathe. Adisa was beside him. Adisa was always there for the significant moments, which was why Elias had requested him specifically for the liaison support team, and which was why Adisa had accepted, because thinking hard was still a 2-person job. 3 years, Adisa said. 3 years. 46 more colony groups. Yes. You know, Adisa said thoughtfully, when I signed on to this unit, the job description said nothing about this. No, Elias agreed. Adisa was quiet for a moment, then, I'm not complaining. I know. The creature, the Caliph Prime Resonator, the colony's heartbeat, the survivor of a lost world who had settled for a borrowed one, made a sound. Low and warm, below hearing, felt in the chest. Elias hummed in response, the old song, the impractical one, the one that refused to resolve where it was supposed to. The creature's sound shifted slightly to harmonize. They stayed like that for a while, the three of them, until the light changed and the cold came on, and the day moved into its next thing. Around them, on the plain, on 46 other plains and valleys and coastlines, 46 other enormous patient things were breathing and adjusting, and in 46 towns and cities and villages, people were making their own adjustments, with the specific human mixture of pragmatism and fear and generosity and stubbornness that was, it turned out, more recognizable to the rest of the universe than anyone had thought. Sevarin called him that evening. She did not use the translator. She spoke in her own language, and he followed approximately 60% of it, and they were both comfortable with the 40% he missed, because they had both long since understood that full understanding was not the prerequisite. The prerequisite was showing up. She told him, in the portion he understood, that the Convergence Council had voted to formally register Earth as an associate world of the Convergence. Not a member, not yet. The process for membership took decades, but present, acknowledged, no longer alone in the particular way that Earth had been alone for the entirety of its existence. She told him that the Caliph Prime Resonators, through the acoustic bridge technology that was now partially functional, had transmitted something that the specialists described as a collective acknowledgement, which was the closest Caliph equivalent to gratitude. She told him that the record of the integration process, including the acoustic sessions, would be added to the Convergence Archive of First Contacts, the document that all 17 member species contributed to, the record of all the moments that had been hardest and most costly and most revelatory. He would be in that archive. The humming would be in that archive. His mother's impractical song, in the chest of an old man standing in a field in Hungary, harmonized by something the size of a city block that had come from the space between stars. That would be in the record that the Convergence kept of the moments that made it worth building. He thought about telling her how much that mattered. He thought about the words for it, in his language and her partial language, and the 40% he was still learning. He thought about how some things were exactly the size they were, and couldn't be made smaller by language without losing something essential, and how some moments were meant to be held without being described. He hummed instead, a few bars, the old song, just enough. Through the receiver, at a distance of 4 light-years plus the Vienna Conference Center, he heard Sevarin make that sound, low and brief and resonant. The one that the translator always declined to render, the one that was laughter but also something older and wider than laughter, the sound of recognition, the sound of having reached the place you were trying to reach and finding something there you didn't entirely expect. He stood on the plain until dark, the creature breathed. The stars came out, more of them than any human city usually let you see, a depth of them that reminded you that the space between everything was also a kind of connection, a shared medium through which sound and light, and occasionally, something enormous and frightened could travel to find an unexpected harbor. He went home. He would be back tomorrow. He was always back tomorrow, which was the only thing in the end that any of it had ever required. The second year was harder than the first. This surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. The first year had the momentum of the new. Every day brought something unprecedented, and unprecedented things carried their own energy, their own sense of purpose. You woke up not knowing what the day would require and found out by being present for it, and the not knowing was exhausting but also alive. By the second year, the unprecedented had become the ongoing, and the ongoing required a different kind of endurance. Not the sprint endurance of emergency, but the steady pace endurance of maintenance, which was harder to romanticize. 47 colony groups did not integrate at the same speed. The group on the Hungarian plain was, the specialists said, unusual in its responsiveness. Something about the magnetic properties of the region, something about the specific acoustic environment of the steppe. Other colony groups in different geographies were slower. 3 were much slower, in ways that the convergence resonance specialists described carefully and without alarm, which Elias had learned meant that they were somewhat alarmed. The colony group that had arrived over the western Siberian shelf showed signs of what the specialists called resonance fragmentation, a condition in which the prime resonator could not fully establish its baseline frequency in the new environment, which left the colony group in a state of prolonged partial disorientation. It was the convergence's equivalent of a patient who was not deteriorating but was not recovering, and it required a level of attention that the integration protocol had not originally planned for. He flew to Siberia in November. He took Adisa with him because he always took Adisa with him, and he took a convergence acoustic specialist named Orev who was 30 years old by convergence reckoning, whatever that meant in human terms, and who spoke 6 convergence languages and no human ones, which meant they communicated through a tablet translation application and the universal language of pointing at things. The Siberian plain was colder than Hungary in ways that were not only meteorological. There was a quality to the air there, not hostile, nothing so active but uncommunicative, as if the landscape had never been asked to carry a human presence and had not made space for it. The military installation was temporary structures on frozen ground, and the personnel there had the particular flatness of people who had been assigned to a single unchanging task in an unchanging landscape for many months, and had used up most of their available responses to it. The Kalith colony group sat 3 kilometers out as they all did. Its prime resonator was less visible than the Hungarian one. It held a lower posture, closer to the earth, which Orev indicated on the tablet was a sign of the fragmentation. Compressed, the translation read, like a person with a headache who has closed the curtains. He stood at the perimeter and hummed. The Siberian wind took most of it and the rest went flat in the cold. The prime resonator did not move its head. He tried for 20 minutes and got nothing back. He tried again the next morning, and the next. On the 4th morning, standing in the pre-dawn dark with his breath clouding and Adisa beside him and Orev watching the resonance readings on a handheld device, he tried something different. He stopped humming the Hungarian song. He hummed something else instead. Nothing composed, nothing remembered, just a sound that felt right for the place, shaped by the cold and the flatness and the particular stillness of a landscape that held its breath all the time and had no warmth to spare. The resonance readings moved, not dramatically, a shift at the edge of measurable, but it moved. Orev wrote on the tablet, "You adjusted to it rather than asking it to adjust to you." He looked at the screen for a moment, then, "Is that what I did?" Orev wrote, "That is what it detected." He thought about this. In all the sessions on the Hungarian plain, he had used the same song, his song from his landscape, his tradition. The Kalith colony there had eventually harmonized with it, had found the frequency in him and met it. But that colony had been responsive from the start, had been in a landscape that resonated easily. The Siberian colony was compressed, withdrawn, struggling to find its baseline. Meeting it where it was meant, not offering his frequency and waiting for it to come toward him, but going toward it. Finding what sound fit this cold, flat place and letting that be the bridge. It took 3 more weeks of daily sessions, with Orev adjusting the acoustic protocol in real time based on the readings, before the prime resonator of the Siberian colony began to respond consistently. The response was quieter than the Hungarian colony's, slower, less warm, but it was real, and the resonance specialists confirmed that the fragmentation readings had begun to stabilize. He flew back to Vienna and wrote a report about adaptive acoustic approach that he knew would be read by the convergence xenobiology team, and probably by no one in any human government. And that was fine, because the human governments were mostly still working through their legal frameworks and could catch up later. Savarin called him the night he returned to Vienna. She called to tell him that the Siberian report had been circulated to all active integration sites, and that the resonance teams at 2 other slow integrating sites had already begun applying the adaptive approach, and were seeing early positive results, and that the Convergence Acoustic Archive now contained his name in the section on novel first contact techniques, which meant that some version of his method would be taught to convergence contact specialists for as long as the convergence maintained records. Which was to say, indefinitely. He sat on the edge of his bunk in the Vienna quarters assigned to him, a room that was neither large nor comfortable, but had a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and he held his phone and thought about that for a while. "I didn't invent anything," he told her when the translator rendered her explanation. "I just paid attention." "Yes," she said in the convergence language, and he heard in the word the weight she was putting into it, the specific gravity of yes that means. "You have described exactly what is rare and valuable and too often absent. Yes, that is precisely what you did." The 3rd year brought its own category of difficulty, which was political rather than acoustic. The first wave of human political resistance to the integration had been immediate and loud. The usual voices calling the Caliph a threat, calling the convergence an imposition on human sovereignty, calling for militarized responses that the briefing documents had specifically identified as catastrophically counterproductive. That wave had largely broken against the simple fact of the Caliph's non-aggression. 47 colony groups had sat motionless for months without harming anything, which made the threat narrative increasingly difficult to sustain. But the second wave was subtler and in some ways harder to answer because it came from a different direction. It came from people who were not afraid of the Caliph, but were afraid of what human contact with the Caliph represented. Not invasion but transformation, the slow alteration of what humanity was when it understood itself as no longer alone, no longer the only kind of intelligence the universe had to offer. This fear was less shoutable and more pervasive, and it ran through the conversations Elias had with the village near the Hungarian plain, with the military personnel at the integration sites, with the diplomats in the corridors of the Vienna sessions, with the ordinary people he spoke to when he traveled. He talked to Erzsébet about it on a gray March morning when the plain was soft with early thaw and the creature was visible against the low sky, its breathing making small fog plumes in the cold. She had brought soup, which she usually did, and they sat on the camp chairs outside the security post and ate it, and she listened to him describe the political moment with the practical attention she brought to everything. "People are afraid they'll be different after," he said. "Afraid that knowing there are others out there, knowing that the Caliph are here and the convergence exists, will change what it means to be human." Erzsébet considered her soup. "Will it?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes, probably." "Good," she said. He looked at her. She gestured toward the creature on the plain with her spoon. "I was different after 1956. I was different after my husband died. I was different after my son came back from Afghanistan. Different doesn't mean worse. It means you've had more life." She looked at the creature, at the vast patient thing that breathed and harmonized and had moved itself away from her village so she would not be afraid, and her expression was the one she had when she was being precise. Those things came here because their home was destroyed. They didn't choose to be here. They're making do. If my being different because of them is the price of them having somewhere to be, that's a price I can pay. He told Savarin this too. He told Savarin a lot of things that Erzsébet said, because Erzsébet's thinking had a quality of distilled clarity that he had come to rely on, and because Savarin listened to them with the attention of someone receiving something genuinely useful rather than charming. "She is 84 years old, Savarin said, when he explained who Erzsébet was. Yes, and she lives near the colony group. 3 kilometers. She can see it from her kitchen window. Sevarin was quiet for a moment. Then I would like to meet her. The meeting between Sevarin, Queen Speaker of the Galactic Convergence, and Ursabit, retired schoolteacher of a village in the Hungarian plain, occurred on a Tuesday in April, and was attended by exactly 4 people. The 2 of them, Elias and Adissa, who had insisted on being present on the grounds that someone needed to write down what Ursabit said in case it turned out to be important, which it always did. Sevarin arrived in the village's single cafe, a place with an espresso machine of uncertain vintage and 4 tables and a hand-painted sign, and performed the greeting gesture with the full formal precision she used in official sessions. And Ursabit, who had been briefed on the gesture by Elias the previous evening, performed it back with the slight rightward head inclination done correctly, and then said, in Hungarian which Adissa translated, "I've seen you on television. You're taller in person." The translator rendered this for Sevarin. Sevarin made the sound that was not quite laughter. And then they sat and drank coffee, Ursabit's terrible espresso, and something warm from the Convergence officer's flask, and talked for 2 hours about small things and large things in the specific way that people talk when they have both decided to be honest, and have long since stopped being impressed by the size of the conversation they're in. He watched them, Elias did, and he thought, this is the thing that the briefings will never capture, not the protocols and the legal frameworks and the resonance mapping and the formal sessions. This, 2 beings sitting across a table with their hands wrapped around warm cups, being honest with each other about what it cost to be alive in a hard world that kept requiring more of you. This was the thing that the nobles and the delegates had declined when they'd let their lawyers decide whether to perform the greeting. Not the formal recognition of authority, not the legal implications, this. The simple human, and as it turned out, not exclusively human, possibility of sitting across from something different and deciding to keep looking. The 3rd year ended. The 47th colony group completed its resonance mapping, in a ceremony that the Convergence marked with something Elias didn't have a word for, a collective resonance event. All 47 prime resonators producing their frequencies simultaneously for the first time. A sound felt rather than heard across a significant portion of Earth's surface. A sound that the seismic stations registered as a minor anomaly, and that every person near a colony group registered as something that made them stop what they were doing for a moment and stand very still. The way you stand still when something passes through you that you don't understand but recognize. Elias stood on the Hungarian plain. The creature near him, the one he had spent 3 years learning to listen to, the one that had harmonized with his mother's song, the one that had become as familiar to him as the landscape it now belonged to, produced its frequency with a fullness he had never heard before, a resonance that wasn't fragmented or cautious or new to a world, but settled, present, real. The sound moved through him like something returning to where it had always been supposed to be. He didn't hum back. He didn't need to. He just stood in the field with his hands open at his sides, in the posture of mutual acknowledgement, and let it move through him. Adissa stood beside him and was silent, the silence of someone who understood that this was not a moment for commentary. After a while, Elias said, "What do you think they'll remember of us when this is written down?" Adissa thought about it. "The humming," he said, "probably." Elias almost laughed. "That's what they'll remember about the human race, that a sergeant from a rapid response unit hummed at something." "You also knelt," Adissa said, "when nobody else would, when all the people with titles and frameworks and 30-day approval processes were still figuring out if they were allowed to." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing about humanity that surprises them, I think. We're terrible at the official version of things and sometimes very good at the actual version." The plain was darkening at its edges, the light pulling back toward the horizon. The creature breathed. The stars were beginning to show. "Come on," Elias said. "Ursabit will have food." They walked back across the plain toward the village, and behind them the creature settled further into the earth it had chosen, and the stars came out, and somewhere across 4 light years, Sevarin noted in the Convergence archive that the human liaison had been present for the completion, as he had been present for every significant moment in the 3-year process, which was the simplest and most complete description of what he had done. He had been present. In the end, that was the whole of it.